Hi folks, welcome back. So, in the last video, I talked about self-regarding reasons, individual other regarding reasons, and collective other regarding reasons that you might have for engaging in practices of social distance and mask wearing, for adhering to these protocols. But one really sort of sneaky objection, or sneaky and powerful objection to the sorts of reasons that we've been considering is, especially the collective other regarding reasons, is that your practices, your decision to engage in social distancing and wear a mask will only really have a significant impact if others do the same thing, right? Your actions are just a drop in the bucket. They don't have a measurable impact in most cases. Most of the times you leave the house and choose to wear a mask, or you choose not to go into a place because it looks a little bit too crowded to you, or you choose not to see family or have some friends over, likely don't have an impact at all. Most of those times your actions are just, they're basically symbolic. Right? They have no measurable impact as long as most others are, if most others are socially distancing, then your actions are unlikely to have much of an impact. And if most others aren't, then we're all in trouble anyways. And so because your individual action isn't going to have much of an effect at all. And if your actions don't have a measurable effect on the well-being of identifiable others, then it's really difficult to say that you have an obligation to social distance or to wear a mask. Right? If you're choosing not to wear a mask when you go out today, isn't likely to have any impact at all on any particular other people, then who's your obligation to? Who do you have a duty to wear a mask? Now, an obligation is a particularly strong sort of reason. It means that you ought to do this thing, and you are open to being sanctioned. Sanctions against you are justifiable for not doing this thing. Right? You really, it's not just that you kind of should, or you have a good reason to, it's that you must do this thing. It's really hard to make a convincing argument that, in fact, we do have such an obligation to engage in these social distancing practices precisely because our decision not to, in particular instances, likely doesn't affect any particular individuals, likely doesn't have any measurable effect at all, doesn't affect identifiable other people who are likely to be harmed by our actions. We'll call this the causal impotence objection. There's actually a lot of literature on the causal impotence objection in discussions of our responses to global climate change. We face a similar problem. Your individual actions have almost no impact at all. Right? Whether you drive a gas-guzzling car or a hybrid or a plug-in, really doesn't affect things very much. We need large collective actions in order to have an effect. We face a similar problem here. Your individual actions don't have much of an effect. What matters is the aggregate. What matters is collectively us choosing to engage in these social distancing practices and mask-wearing practices. That's what's going to slow the spread. So then what reason do you have, or do you have such an obligation? Well, there are a couple of ways we might try to respond to the causal impotence objection. One response we could give appeals to the collective other regarding reasons again. And these sorts of responses are what we call moral mathematics arguments or moral mathematics responses. We're going to look at two forms of them, a statistical form and a threshold form. The statistical form of the moral mathematics argument says that even if my contribution doesn't have a direct measurable impact on an identifiable other, I don't save any particular person by not wearing a mask, or by wearing my mask today, or harm any particular person by not wearing my mask today, we can grasp the impact in terms of a statistical generalization. So I just made these numbers up, but suppose that for each person who fails to social distance, fatalities increase by a half a person. That's probably really high. It's probably more like 0.01 or 0.001 of a person. But just for the sake of argument, suppose that each person who fails to social distance, fatalities increase. Right? So your choosing not to engage in these practices leads to indirectly half a death. You're half responsible for the death of one person about it, right? So we can grasp it in terms of this sort of statistical generalization. Your action doesn't have a particular causal impact, but because if everyone would act in that way, it would lead to more deaths. You have some responsibility for choosing not to wear a mask or choosing not to engage in social distancing. And according to one study, recent study, 95% compliance with mask wearing would lead to a 58% reduction in death. So we can see that there's some grounds for this sort of statistical reasoning, right? If more people complied, fewer people would die. If fewer people comply, more people will die. Your compliance, your individual compliance probably has no measurable effect, but your individual compliance is part of this statistical whole, and we can attribute the effects of this statistical whole to your actions. At least that's the thought of the moral mathematics response. Another sort of moral mathematics argument is a threshold argument. So presumably people gather somewhat regularly without spreading the virus. Most parties you'd attend or most places you'd go aren't going to be super spreader events. But every nth gathering is a super spreading event, right? They happen. We can't predict which one's going to be. You don't know whether it's the event you're hosting or the one you're going to. Whether that's going to be a super spreading event or whether your failure to wear a mask is going to lead to a super spreading event. And since you don't know, you should take precautions. Right? They're low probability, but extremely high cost. Low probability, but extremely high cost outcomes. So the expected utility for these actions is really, really low. Right? The expected utility of really, really negative, actually. It's a disutility of not wearing a mask or of going to a party, right? Because most of the time you're going to get some utility out of showing up to a party. It's going to make you feel good. It's going to be fun. Your friends are going to enjoy seeing you. But every nth time you go to a party, some unpredictable number of times that you go to a party, it's going to end up being a super spreading event. And your utility of having gone there and been part of this super spreading event is going to be extremely negative because it's going to lead to a great deal of suffering and pain for other people. People you may not know, your friend's cousin's grandmother, who ends up dying of COVID-19, or maybe people you know, but it's going to lead to a great deal of disutility. And utilitarians we're going to talk about later in the semester are going to say that we have an obligation to act in ways that create the greatest good for the greatest number, to create the greatest amount of general utility. And you're failing to do that if you don't take into account the great disutility of the one threshold action that you take. Right? So for most of your actions, there might be some utility and very little disutility, but the one threshold action has great disutility, and you're responsible for that. Right? You should not have acted, and you can't predict which one's going to be that threshold action. So you just need to be careful. Right? That's a threshold argument, or a threshold moral mathematics argument. Now, maybe you find those convincing, maybe you don't. But there's another direction. There's a few other directions we can still go. We also might appeal to fairness here. When you don't follow the protocols, you don't social distance, you don't wear a mask, then you're taking advantage of the sacrifices that others are making. Right? Your risk is low enough that you feel comfortable taking this risk, going out without a mask, only because others are sacrificing, only because others are adhering to these protocols. So it's the collective action of these others that creates this benefit. And you're laying claim to this benefit. You're saying, it's mine. I'm going to take advantage of it. But it wouldn't exist if others didn't restrict their liberty. And because it's the result of others restricting their liberty, and we haven't made any collective decision about how to distribute this social good that's been created now, this lowered risk, you have no right to claim it for yourself. You have no right to this benefit. Essentially, you're making an exception for yourself. The benefit you're claiming wouldn't exist if everyone made exceptions. If it was universally everyone just did what you were doing, then this benefit wouldn't exist. But because others are following the protocols, they are social distancing, they are wearing a mask, this benefit of lowered risk does exist, and you're claiming it for yourself? What right do you have to that? That's not fair, right? It's no fair to claim that for yourself. Fairness requires that we have to find a way of distributing it fairly or equitably to everyone, or it doesn't belong to anyone at all. No one gets the benefit of that decreased risk. No one can claim it for themselves, so no one can create an exception for themselves and violate these social distancing policies. I really find these fairness-based arguments to be pretty convincing. I think that it helps to explain the intuition that we have when we see people violating social distancing practices, that they're doing something unfair, right? They're claiming a benefit that they shouldn't be claiming. That they're taking something that only exists because the rest of us are suffering. The rest of us are sacrificing. And who the hell are they to claim that for themselves? Why do they get it? That seems to be the idea. All right. I have one more set of arguments I'm going to talk about in the fourth video. I'm going to cut this one off right here.